Okay, let's unpack this. We've all heard the phrase financial literacy. Sounds so straightforward, right? You know how to handle your money. But today, we are diving deep into something much more sophisticated. We're talking about how these skills, this knowledge, and the behaviors around money are not only defined by global institutions, but how they're systematically measured. And maybe most critically, how they're consistently mismeasured in ways that can really hurt us.
It's a cornerstone issue of the modern economy, truly. This isn't some niche skill anymore for people on Wall Street. I mean, it's a fundamental life prerequisite. Our mission in this deep dive is to really cut through the noise. We're using sources from the OECD, the US FLEC, various national regulators, all to figure out what it actually means to be financially competent right now in this era.
And to kick things off with the fact that just it immediately makes this feel personal. This isn't some dry technical analysis. Our sources pointed to a Canadian survey where people said that choosing the right investments was more stressful than going to the dentist. I mean, just think about that for a second. More stressful than the dentist. That one data point tells you everything. The stakes aren't just financial, they're psychological. They're tied to our deepest fears.
And that anxiety is completely justified. The financial stakes are just enormous. What our sources show, time and time again, is that financially unsophisticated individuals, usually because they just don't have that foundational knowledge, they really struggle with basic long-term planning. And that struggle, it translates directly into real costs. They pay more for debt, they miss savings opportunities, they react emotionally when the market shifts.
Whereas their financially sophisticated counterparts,
They do the complete opposite. They're comfortable with financial calculations, especially with these really complex, non-intuitive ideas like compound interest or the real impact of inflation over time. That knowledge, that competency lets them get lower credit borrowing rates, they can do effective tax planning, and ultimately it just lets them accumulate wealth. The difference is, quite literally, the gap between building wealth and paying these high, unnecessary costs your entire life. Understanding that gap and how to close it, that's what we're getting into today.
okay, so let's anchor ourselves with a really basic question. What is financial literacy? Because there are a ton of definitions floating around, but our sources show there's this three-part consensus emerging globally.
That's right. The broadest definition, the one you see pretty much everywhere, defines it as having the skills, knowledge, and behaviors to make informed decisions about money. You'll see terms like financial education or financial knowledge used all the time, sort of interchangeably. But we have to remember that literacy is the application of the knowledge. It's not just having it.
But the definition gets a lot bigger when you look at how different global institutions frame it, right? It goes way beyond just knowing a few terms. It's about navigating some of the most stressful moments in your life.
Precisely. We can start with the GAO, the Government Accountability Office in the US. Back in 2010, they came out with a very practical, application-focused definition. They called it the ability to make informed judgments and to take effective actions about your money, both now and in the future. And crucially, the GAO said this literacy has to cover the big life events. We're talking job loss, saving for retirement, figuring out how to pay for your kids' education. It frames literacy as this resilience tool, to help you weather the biggest financial shocks you're going to face.
Okay, and then if we jump forward a decade, you have the Financial Literacy and Education Commission, FLEC, in 2020. You add another layer, this idea of personal capability.
FLEC really refined it. They talked about the skills and knowledge, but they paired it with a really critical idea, access. Access to financial products and services. So when policymakers talk about financial capability, they mean this whole picture. The person is ready and informed, sure, but the market is also accessible and fair. It's this recognition that knowledge is kind of useless if the system shuts you out.
And then finally, the National Financial Educators Council, the NFEEC, adds a psychological piece that I think gets right back to that listener who feels totally overwhelmed.
Yeah, they define it as having the skills and knowledge to confidently take effective action. And that one word, confidently, that's the direct link back to that Canadian anxiety study. You can have the knowledge, you can have the access, but if you don't have the psychological strength to actually apply it without being paralyzed by stress or fear, you're still stuck. Confidence is the bridge from knowing to doing.
Which brings us to what a lot of people see as the global standard for this, the OECD PS's view. It seems to pull all these pieces together.
It does. The OECD's Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, they have this really detailed two-part definition from 2018. And since it's used to assess 15-year-olds all over the world, it has to be solid. Part one is the inputs. the knowledge, understanding financial concepts, risks, that sort of thing. But part two is about the outputs and the psychology. It's the skills, the motivation, and again, that word confidence, to apply that knowledge in all these different situations.
So it's not enough to just memorize what inflation is. You have to
Yeah.
be motivated and confident enough to actually change how you save or spend because of it.
Exactly. The real measure isn't what you score on a test, it's what you do next. And the PISA framework is very clear about the ultimate goal here. It's to improve the financial well-being of people and society, to let them participate fully in economic life. It really elevates financial literacy from, a nice-to-have life skill to a basic requirement for being a citizen in the modern world.
This all sounds great, a noble goal. But here's where we hit what our sources call the measurement paradox. This is a huge aha moment. We have to talk about objectively measured literacy versus subjectively measured literacy. This is where what you think you know crashes into cold, hard math.
And this distinction is everything in behavioral economics and policy research. Objective literacy is all about performance. It's quantitative. The questions are direct. Can you solve a problem with compound interest? Do you really get how diversification lowers risk? Can you explain, with numbers, how inflation is eating away at your savings?
And the researchers don't need some hour-long exam for this, do they? The tools they use are surprisingly simple.
That's right. A lot of the really influential research in this space, especially from people like Anna Maria Lusardi and Olivia Mitchell, uses what they call the big three questions, or sometimes a 5-item test. They're just short, targeted questions about interest rates, savings, and inflation. And the results are, well, they're stark. In many studies, if you only get 3 out of those 5 basic questions right, you are classified as having low financial literacy. It's a very low bar, but it reveals this massive, widespread knowledge gap, even in advanced economies.
Okay, so contrast that with subjective literacy, which is just how good you think you are.
Exactly. It's just your self-perception. How confident are you in managing debt? How well do you understand investments? And this is where all the behavioral biases creep in and just cloud the picture.
This is the paradox that Lusardi and Mitchell found, right?
Yeah, it is. They found that people consistently rate their subjective financial literacy, how good they think they are, way higher than their objective scores. It's a classic behavioral bias, a bit like the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people with low competence, they just lack the ability to even recognize their own incompetence.
So the less you know, the more you think you've got it all figured out. But what's the actual danger here? Is it just bragging rights?
Oh no, the danger is very real. That overconfidence is why people make terrible decisions. If you think you know enough about investing, you won't get professional advice. You won't read the fine print. You won't bother comparison shopping for a loan. And that overestimation leads directly to incredibly costly mistakes over a lifetime.
And the Australian data point our sources provide is maybe the most famous and, frankly, terrifying illustration of this gap.
It is terrifying because it's about compound interest, which is arguably the single most important concept for anyone trying to save for the long term. In Australia, 67% of people said they understood compound interest, 2/3. But then when they were asked to actually solve a simple calculation using that concept, only 28% could do it correctly.
Wow. I find that just staggering.
Mm-hmm.
Is the problem that people are just ignorant, or is it that they confuse recognizing the term with actually mastering the math? Where does the research draw that line?
It's the latter, and the research is very clear on this. People confuse familiarity with mastery. They hear compound interest on the news, they see it on a bank statement, and they just assume they get it. But the real test is applying it. If you can't accurately figure out how a 10% interest rate on a loan compounds every month, you don't just have a math problem. You have a literacy problem that is going to cost you money for years. This disconnect between feeling informed and actually being able to do the calculation, that is the biggest hurdle for any effective education program.
So moving on, the conversation around financial literacy, it's had to evolve. It's not just about budgeting and interest anymore. The world's just too complex. Our sources get into 3 critical new types of literacy that really reflect these new pressures. Let's start with what researchers are calling critical financial literacy.
This is such a crucial evolution because it totally shifts the focus of financial failure. Traditional education is all about, I didn't save enough, so I failed. Why?
Critical literacy asks, wait a minute, why is the system set up in a way that makes it so hard to save, or that pushes all this risk onto me?
And this is where we get into the political argument that some academics are making, right? The ones working in social justice or critical pedagogy. They argue that traditional education can be a passive tool. Exactly. The core argument, and it is a political one, is that traditional financial ed can, sometimes without meaning to, justify this huge shift of risk from corporations and governments back onto individuals. I mean, just think about the last 40 years. We went from defined benefit pensions, where the company took the risk, to 401ks, where you take all the market risk. Add in skyrocketing tuition, spiraling healthcare costs. All of these risks that used to be managed by big institutions are now your problem.
So if the education just teaches you how to manage the risk you've been handed, it never asks why you were handed that risk in the first place, or if the whole game is even fair.
Precisely. Critical literacy is about understanding systemic injustice, institutional failure, social exclusion. It stops you from seeing financial failure as just this: apolitical personal character flaw, a lack of discipline, when the real cause might be predatory lending practices that are perfectly legal within the system. It adds that layer of asking, is this product designed to trap me? Is this system fair? Instead of just, how do I survive this unfair system?
That is a really fundamental pivot. But let me push back on that for a second. If the goal is to fight the system, does the research say that teaching this actually makes people more financially successful, in terms of their savings, their objective well-being? Or does it just make them more aware and maybe more angry about their situation?
That is the open question, and the research is still pretty new here. Critical literacy isn't really about improving your score on a compound interest test. It's more about improving your agency, your ability to push for better regulation, to advocate for change, and to spot and avoid products that are designed to extract wealth, not build it. The goal is more about long-term systemic health, not just optimizing your own situation within a broken system. It's about being a critical citizen in the economy, not just a passive consumer.
Okay, that clarity helps a lot.
Okay.
Let's move to the next layer of complexity, which seems less about personal saving and more about corporate health. Accounting literacy.
Right. Accounting literacy is basically learning the language of business. It's the ability to read, analyze, and actually understand a company's financial statements. So we're talking about the balance sheet, what it owns and owes, the income statement, and the cash flow statement.
This sounds vital for an investor, obviously, but also for an employee who wants to know if their company is stable, or a small business owner.
Absolutely. But the real sophistication, where true accounting literacy comes in, is understanding how that information can be, well, manipulated.
And our sources cite Roman L. Weil, who really highlighted the difference between just reading the statements and truly understanding them.
Weil's point was that true financial literacy means understanding the important accounting judgments the management makes. You have to understand why they make them and how those judgments can be used, sometimes legally, to manipulate how the company looks on paper. It's not just reading the numbers, it's reading the motivations behind them.
What kind of judgments are we talking about? Can you give me an example of this kind of manipulation?
Sure. A classic one is revenue recognition. Management gets to make a judgment call on when to count revenue. Is it when the product ships? When the customer pays? When the service is totally done? Aggressive management might recognize that revenue earlier to hit a quarterly target, which makes the company look great today but could weaken a future quarter. Or they might use aggressive estimates for future costs, like warranty claims, or choose a depreciation schedule that makes income look better right now. Accounting literacy lets you spot those estimates and ask, is this reasonable, or are they just trying to manage expectations?
That kind of insight seems absolutely critical for corporate governance.
And policymakers agreed. After some of the big financial scandals in the late 90s, this became a huge issue. The 1999 Blue Ribbon Committee recommended that public companies have at least 3 members on their audit committee with basic financial literacy. And they defined that explicitly as being able to read and understand not just the statements, but the judgments that go into them. It's essential for preventing corporate meltdowns.
Okay, finally, we have to talk about the area that's changing the fastest, driven by Fintech. Digital financial literacy.
Absolutely. This is the essential merger of your objective financial knowledge and your digital capability. With technology now in every single financial transaction, from Venmo to Robinhood, if you lack specific digital skills, your core financial knowledge can become useless pretty fast.
So it's way more than just knowing how to use your bank's app. The research talks about 4 key dimensions, right?
Right. There are 4 non-negotiable dimensions. First is just digital knowledge, understanding the basics of how digital finance works, how data moves. Second is awareness of digital financial services, knowing what's out there, from robo-advisors to new payment apps. Third is the tacit knowledge of using those services, the practical hands-on ability to navigate an interface, manage your passwords, and not make a mistake.
And the fourth one, which seems to be the most urgent.
The fourth one, which is driving so much of the policy urgency, is the crucial ability to avoid digital fraud. And this is way beyond just spotting a phishing email now. We're talking about sophisticated identity theft, crypto scams, social engineering, things that can fool even financially savvy people.
That point about fraud seems to be the main driver for the OECD and others.
It is because digitalization is a double-edged sword. It creates efficiency, but it also creates massive vulnerability. The OECD has flagged the urgent need for digital financial literacy programs for everyone because fraud victimization has just exploded as these services have grown. You could be a genius at calculating your mortgage amortization, but you can still lose your entire life savings to a simple SIM swapping scam if you don't have the specific digital literacy to spot the threat. This is why the new interventions have to combine technical finance education with very specific digital safety training.
Okay, so given that this is a global necessity, from understanding interest to avoiding fraud, it's no surprise that governments have stepped in. Let's look at the big coordinated efforts that started, 2 decades ago?
The first big push was really led by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, way back in 2003. They realized that since capital flows globally, the standards for consumer protection and literacy had to be global too. So they started a project to develop common principles, let governments share what works, and make sure standards were consistent.
And that grew into this central resource for all the member countries.
Exactly. In 2008, the OECD launched the International Gateway for Financial Education. It's basically a clearinghouse for research, data, and policy information. It created this foundation that national governments could then use to build their own strategies, so they weren't all starting from scratch.
And this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Other countries were launching their own initiatives around the same time.
Right. In the UK, the Financial Services Authority, which is now the FCA, started a national strategy on financial capability in 2003. They were one of the first. And in the US, the federal government set up its Financial Literacy and Education Commission, FLEC, also in 2003. So the early 2000s were really this moment of global consensus that, yes, we need to intervene at a national level.
So let's look at how these interventions actually played out around the world, starting with some really unique approaches in the Asia-Pacific and the Middle East. There's a fascinating example from Mongolia.
The Mongolian case is one of the best examples of tailoring a program to the local environment. The Asian Development Bank was key here. They knew that, traditional classroom seminars weren't going to reach vulnerable households. They saw that TV was the main source of information for over 80% of the population.
So instead of a boring pamphlet, they used a story?
Exactly. They supported the production of a TV serial drama, basically a financial soap opera. And the plot lines would naturally weave in these crucial financial lessons. So a character facing debt problems might go see a financial advisor, and that scene would clearly explain the difference between a high-interest payday loan and a better option.
And did it actually work? Did it change behavior?
It worked remarkably well. The results were immediate. Surveys after the show aired showed that more Mongolians were actually expanding their financial options. Specifically, more people were actively comparing interest rates on loans and savings accounts, which is a key indicator that they're applying the knowledge. It really proved that the delivery method has to be culturally relevant and easy to digest.
Singapore, on the other hand, took a very different approach. Very institutional, very structured, focusing on the entire education system and workforce.
Right. Singapore set up two main bodies. First, back in 2007, they created the Financial Literacy Hub for teachers. The strategy wasn't to just create one boring class, but to empower all teachers to weave financial concepts into their subjects, math, social studies, you name it. So students are getting these concepts reinforced all the time in relevant ways.
And what about for adults who are already working?
That's the Institute for Financial Literacy, set up in 2012. It's run by their national program, Money Sense, and a polytechnic. And this is crucial. It provides free and unbiased financial education programs to over 110,000 working adults. The key word there is unbiased. There's no product selling. It's just pure education on everything from retirement to estate planning.
Okay, now let's go to Saudi Arabia, which is just a perfect confirmation of that subjective versus objective paradox we talked about earlier.
A 2012 survey of young Saudi nationals really exposed this huge, worrying disconnect. The survey found that 75% of the youth felt they understood the basics of money management, but only 11%, a tiny fraction, actually kept track of their spending with a budget.
And the behavioral data was even worse, pointing to a real lack of a savings culture.
It was devastating for long-term wealth building. The analysis showed a massive 45% of those young people saved no money at all, and 46% were still depending on their parents for big purchases. Things like fancy phones, travel, luxury goods. That was nearly 80% of their spending. It showed Saudi policymakers that the problem wasn't just knowledge, they felt informed. It was about behavior. They needed to build a culture of saving and tracking.
Why does the government care so much about that? It sounds like personal spending.
It matters deeply because if a huge part of your youth isn't building personal savings, they become dependent on their parents or the state when there's an economic shock. It places this huge future burden on the entire national economy. The good news was that 90% of them said they wanted to learn more, so the appetite was there, but the application just wasn't.
And quickly, in India, you have this example of massive coordinated regulatory power.
India's approach is unique because of the sheer scale of its market. The National Center for Financial Education, the NCFE, is run by 4 major regulators at the same time: the Reserve Bank of India, the Securities Regulator, the Insurance Regulator, and the Pension Regulator. It's a unified approach to make sure the message is consistent across banking, investing, insurance, everything.
And what kinds of topics are they covering?
They're really getting into the weeds of modern financial infrastructure, training on digital payments, the importance of PAN cards, which are like a tax ID, using demat accounts for holding stocks electronically, and constantly teaching the power of compounding. It's a top-down, unified message for the entire country.
Okay, shifting over to Europe, we see some very specific national strategies. France, in particular, mixed standard education with some really creative public outreach.
France launched its EDUFI strategy in 2016. They put the Banque de France, their central bank, in charge of implementing it, which gave it a lot of authority.
And what were the interventions they focused on?
The standard stuff was there: budgeting courses, education for youth and entrepreneurs. But the most innovative thing was in 2019 when they opened the Cité de l'Économie, the City of the Economy.
A museum. How do you teach finance and economics in a museum?
It's not a traditional museum, it's more of an interactive learning center. The first in France dedicated to making economics fun and accessible. The exhibits use simulations, games, historical context to demystify these really complex ideas like debt and markets. It's this commitment to making financial understanding part of the culture, not just part of a classroom.
Now, what about Switzerland, a country we all associate with financial savvy? Did their studies find any gaps?
It's interesting. Switzerland scores very high on objective literacy tests compared to other countries. They do great on questions about interest, inflation, diversification, but internal studies found these fascinating variations. One study of 15-year-olds in the canton of Freiburg found significant differences in the scores of French-speaking students versus German-speaking students in the same region.
Why would a language difference create a financial literacy gap?
Well, it suggests that cultural attitudes towards saving and debt, which can align with language and region, or maybe even differences in the school systems, create this unexpected variability, even in a country that's doing very well overall. The Swiss National Bank is trying to fix this with their Economics initiative, which provides tailored curricula to schools to try and even things out.
Let's turn to the United Kingdom. Their big baseline survey from 2005 highlighted a really worrying generational trend.
That 2005 survey was a wake-up call. The most alarming finding was a clear demographic pattern. On average, people under 40 were less financially capable than their elders. This was a huge deal because it just completely defied the expectation that younger, more educated generations would be better at this stuff.
So why were the under 40s worse off?
It was a mix of things. The older generation had more defined benefit pensions and simpler financial products. The under 40s were hit with the full force of that shift to individual risk, plus rising housing costs and student debt. It led the report to conclude that we are storing up trouble for the future, basically warning of a huge retirement crisis down the line.
And that urgency led them to target very specific, vulnerable groups.
Absolutely. Their plan targeted young adults just starting their careers, new parents, and of course schools. And they even developed a highly specialized program called Money Force for the Armed Forces. It's run by the Royal British Legion and gives tailored advice for the unique challenges service members face: frequent moves, special benefits, transitioning back to civilian life. It shows you really need that granular approach.
Finally, let's look at the Americas. We have to start with Canada, where we got that fact about the dentist.
Right. So after that stressful finding, Canadian regulators really focused on investor education, especially around fraud. This was a priority because the baby boomers were heading into retirement and suddenly had to manage their own savings in these defined contribution plans.
And they had a specific case that really highlighted how vulnerable people were to fraud,
Yeah.
even people who seemed well off.
Yes, the Aeron mortgage study from 2005. It looked at one massive investment fraud with over 2,200 investors, and the report found two very vulnerable groups. First, people nearing retirement without enough money who were desperate for high returns, and second, surprisingly, affluent middle-aged men. This group was often overconfident in their own ability to spot a deal, which goes right back to that subjective literacy paradox. It reinforced that education has to target both the desperate and the overconfident.
And Canada's kept this focus going, especially now with digital finance.
Their current national strategy for 2021 to 2026 is all about building financial resilience after the pandemic, and a huge piece of it is dedicated to addressing the explosion of digital finance and the risks that come with it. It connects directly back to that need for digital financial literacy.
In the United States, the situation seems to be constantly complicated by the huge differences in state requirements, creating this geographic inequality.
The U.S. has really struggled with this persistent gap in required education. A 2009 survey found that while 44 states had guidelines for personal finance in K-12 schools, only 17 states actually required high school students to take a course. And the gap between a guideline and a mandatory graded course is just enormous. It leads to these huge regional disparities.
Which states have taken the lead, and what does that actually look like?
Well, a 2017 survey pointed to Utah as having the highest requirement in the country. Utah mandates a full semester personal finance course to graduate high school. It's comprehensive debt, investing, college planning. On the other hand, you have states like Alaska, Delaware, Hawaii, where financial education is completely dependent on whether the local school board decides to fund it.
And what's the real consequence for students in those states that are lagging behind?
The consequence is that students are entering adult life completely unprepared for fundamental decisions, especially around student debt. If you graduate without understanding the difference between a subsidized and an unsubsidized loan, you are being set up for failure. The quality of your financial capability becomes a lottery based on where you live or how wealthy your parents are, which just makes existing inequality worse.
The federal government did step in, though, to try and address some of this through the Dodd-Frank Act.
Yes. The Dodd-Frank Act in 2010 created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. The CFPB is mandated to promote financial education, but its Office of Minority and Women Inclusion is specifically tasked with targeting these access gaps. The mandate requires them to partner with inner-city high schools, girls' high schools, and minority high schools to enhance their programs. So it's a very targeted federal effort to fill the gaps left by the states.
And finally, just a quick note on Brazil's strategy.
Brazil's national strategy, the ENEF, was developed more recently after they did comprehensive market surveys between 2018 and 2019. It really just highlights the global trend. You have to continuously survey your population to understand the behavioral gaps like we saw in Saudi Arabia, so you can design interventions that actually work.
Okay, so after this huge global tour of definitions, pitfalls, and interventions, let's just take a breath. So what does this all mean? Looking at all this material, what's the single most critical finding for our listener?
I think what emerges really clearly is that financial literacy is a global necessity. There's no escaping it. And it's driven by that fundamental, irreversible shift of financial risk on to you, the individual. The sources paint this very clear, if challenging, picture. Your retirement, your health care, your future, it's now largely determined by what you know and your confidence to apply it.
And the research is basically screaming at us to reject that comfortable feeling of, oh, I get it.
Absolutely. The defining theme is that true, useful literacy is measured objectively. It's about performance on concepts like compound interest and inflation, not how you feel. The Australian and Saudi data prove that overconfidence is this profound behavioral trap that we all have to actively fight against.
And the skills we need aren't static. They're just getting more and more complex.
They are. To manage modern financial risk, you now need two specialized skills beyond just budgeting. First is that critical literacy understanding the system you're in, and second, digital literacy, the practical knowledge to use fintech and, most importantly, to avoid the digital fraud that can wipe out years of savings in an instant.
We did see some clear evidence that these programs can have immediate success, right? Especially with just getting people to sign up for things.
Yes, that's an important nuance. U.S. research shows that when employers offer financial education, workers are way more likely to increase their participation in things like 401k plans. So that's a win. Participation goes up.
But wait, so we're seeing people join the game, but it doesn't guarantee they'll win. Why is that?
That's the core academic debate right now. Education increases participation, sure, But the academic analyses haven't found that it universally improves people's overall financial well-being in every situation. For example, someone might sign up for their 401k, which is a good behavior, but then they continue to make bad investment choices inside it or carry high-interest credit card debt. It suggests that financial education isn't a silver bullet. Its effect is often overshadowed by these deeper economic realities.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. We've established that the whole point of financial literacy, according to the OECD, is to improve individual and societal well-being. But if knowledge is just the ability to apply skills effectively, what happens when these huge external factors, like systemic inequality, crushing student debt, or predatory financial products, what happens when those things just override the effectiveness of your individual knowledge?
We'd encourage you to really consider the relationship between your individual capability, your literacy, your agency, and systemic access and protection, so financial inclusion and regulation. Are they two equal parts needed for stability, or does one always end up canceling out the other? It's a question that gets to the very heart of economic justice, and it requires a lot more than just learning how to make a budget. It requires you to think critically about the system itself and your place in it.